This story is titled, My Parents Blew My Inheritance on My Brother's Fourth Wedding, so I secretly bought their house and rented it to them for double. Now they're crying about family loyalty. I never thought I'd be the kind of person to become a landlord just to get revenge on my own parents, but life has a way of pushing you to extremes. I guess I should start from the beginning, so you can understand how things got so messed up. I'm Jake Mitchell, 32, a software developer from Sacramento. My younger brother Tommy, 29, has always been the golden child, you know the type. While I worked my way through college doing night shifts at Target and graduating with honors in computer science, Tommy was busy finding himself through a series of failed business ventures that my parents kept funding. They remortgaged their house twice to support his dreams of becoming everything from a cryptocurrency expert to an organic kombucha entrepreneur. Our grandmother, Eleanor, was different though. She saw through Tommy's charm and recognized my hard work. When she passed away last year, she left a substantial inheritance, about $850,000, to be split equally between Tommy and me. She had always been smart with her investments, and her late husband's insurance policy had paid off well. The money was supposed to be life-changing for both of us. I had plans. My girlfriend Sarah and I were going to use my share as a down payment on our dream house in the suburbs, maybe start a family. Tommy, predictably, announced he was getting married for the fourth time to a girl named Crystal he'd met at a yoga retreat 2 months prior. She was a spiritual Instagram influencer with 2,300 followers and a suspicious obsession with luxury brands. Here's where things get interesting. My parents, Linda and Robert Mitchell, both 63, were appointed as trustees of the inheritance until both Tommy and I turned 33, just a quirk of Grandma Eleanor's will. She probably thought they'd be responsible with it. Boy, was she wrong. One morning, I got a call from my mom, her voice shaking with what I initially thought was sadness, but later realized was guilt. "Jake, honey, we need to talk about the inheritance," she said. "Something's happened." Turns out, they had blown through not just Tommy's share but mine too, all $850,000, on Tommy's destination wedding in Bali. They'd rented out an entire luxury resort for a week, hired celebrity chefs, and even paid for all 150 guests' airfare. Crystal had apparently convinced Tommy that anything less would be degrading to their spiritual journey. When I confronted them at their house, the same modest 3-bedroom ranch in East Sacramento where I grew up, my dad tried to justify it by saying, "Tommy needed this chance to finally settle down. You're already stable, Jake. You understand family loyalty, don't you?" I sat there in their living room, looking at the familiar family photos on the walls, including one of Grandma Eleanor holding me at my college graduation, and something inside me just snapped. But I didn't yell. I didn't cry. Instead, I smiled and told them I understood. They looked so relieved, probably thinking their responsible eldest son was once again going to be the bigger person. They had no idea what I was about to set in motion, or that their comfortable retirement was about to get a lot more interesting. Little did they know, I'd already contacted my lawyer and discovered something fascinating about their beloved family home's mortgage situation. And Crystal? Well, let's just say she wasn't exactly who she claimed to be, but we'll get to that part later. What my parents didn't know was that their golden child Tommy had a lot more problems than just his commitment issues. While clearing out Grandma Eleanor's house after the funeral, I found something interesting. A folder full of letters from various creditors looking for Tommy. He'd apparently been using Grandma's address to dodge debt collectors for years. The total amount? Almost $300,000 in gambling debts from underground poker games in Reno. I kept this information to myself, along with something else I discovered during my research into Crystal. Her real name was Ashley Parker, and she had 3 other marriages under that name in different states. She was what you'd call a professional gold digger, with a history of marrying wealthy men and disappearing with whatever assets she could liquidate. But here's where it gets really interesting. Remember how I mentioned my parents' mortgage situation? Well, it turns out they'd fallen behind on payments while funding Tommy's various ventures. They were actually 3 months away from foreclosure, but they were too embarrassed to tell anyone. I only found out because I had a friend at the bank, Jennifer, who I dated briefly in college, who gave me a heads up out of courtesy. "Jake, I probably shouldn't be telling you this," she'd said over coffee one day. But your parents' house is going to be listed for short sale next month. They've already received the final notice. That's when the perfect plan started forming in my mind. You see, during those years of living frugally and working my way through college, I'd managed to save up quite a bit. With my software development job at a major tech company and some smart investments in boring but reliable index funds, I had about $400,000 in liquid assets. Not enough to buy a house in California outright, but more than enough for what I had in mind. I created an LLC under the name Mitchell Family Properties. Hiding in plain sight, you might say. Then I had my lawyer friend, Marcus, approach the bank with an offer to buy my parents' house through a short sale. The bank, eager to get the property off their books, accepted our offer of $385,000. The best part? My parents had no idea who was buying their house. They were just told that an investment company had purchased it, and that they could stay as renters if they wanted to. Of course, they agreed. Moving would have been too expensive and embarrassing for them. I set the rent at exactly double their old mortgage payment. It was still below market rate for the area, but high enough to make them feel the pinch every month. Through my LLC, I sent them the new lease agreement, which they signed without much scrutiny. They were just relieved they wouldn't have to move. Everything was going according to plan, but then something unexpected happened. One evening, while I was setting up the rental payment system, I got a frantic call from Tommy. He was sobbing, barely coherent. "Jake, I messed up bad," he choked out. "Crystal, she's not who she says she is. She's gone. And she took everything." I acted surprised, but I'd been waiting for this call. What I hadn't expected was what Tommy said next, something that would throw all my carefully laid plans into chaos and make me question whether I was really the good guy in this story after all. But before I could process that bombshell, my doorbell rang. Standing there was Crystal herself, with a manila envelope and a smile that would make a shark nervous. "Hey, brother-in-law," she said. "We need to talk about your grandmother's real will." I let Crystal into my apartment, against my better judgment. She was wearing the same designer clothes as always, but something was different. Gone was the spiritual Instagram influencer act. This woman moved like a predator. "You're probably wondering why I'm here instead of being in Bali with all that money," she said, making herself comfortable on my couch. "Well, funny story. Turns out your brother isn't the only one who can play games." She opened the manila envelope and pulled out a document that made my blood run cold. It was a DNA test report. According to the results, Tommy wasn't actually my parents' biological son. He was my Uncle Richard's kid, the same uncle who had mysteriously disappeared to South America 29 years ago. "Your grandmother knew," Crystal continued, clearly enjoying herself. "That's why she had that weird clause about waiting until you both turned 33. She was hoping your parents would come clean before then. But they didn't, did they?" My mind was racing. Uncle Richard had been my dad's younger brother, the black sheep of the family. He'd vanished right around the time my mom had announced she was pregnant with Tommy. All these years, I'd never questioned the timing. "How did you find this?" I managed to ask. Crystal's smile widened. "I didn't. Tommy did, 6 months ago. That's why he hired me." Now that was a twist I hadn't seen coming. She went on to explain that Tommy had discovered the truth while snooping through our parents' old documents, looking for anything he could sell or leverage for cash to pay his gambling debts. He'd found letters between our mom and Uncle Richard, and one thing led to another. But instead of confronting our parents, Tommy had concocted an elaborate scheme. He hired Crystal, or Ashley, whatever her real name was, to play the role of the ditzy spiritual influencer. The wedding was never meant to happen. It was all a setup to burn through the inheritance money before it could be legally distributed. "Why?" I asked, though I was starting to see the bigger picture. "Because the inheritance wasn't really his to claim," Crystal explained. "Your grandmother's will had a clause about biological descendants only. If the truth came out, he'd lose everything. So he decided to burn it all down and disappear, just like his real dad." But here's where it got even messier. Crystal pulled out another document, a contract between her and Tommy. According to this, she was supposed to get 70% of the inheritance money for her part in the scheme. Instead, Tommy had tried to double-cross her, booking her a fake ticket to Bali while he planned to flee to Argentina with all the cash. Unfortunately for Tommy, She smirked. I've been doing this a lot longer than he has. The money's in an offshore account that only I can access. And now, I'm willing to make you a deal. My head was spinning. The revenge I'd planned against my parents suddenly seemed small and petty compared to the web of lies I'd stumbled into. But before Crystal could lay out her proposal, my phone buzzed with a text from Sarah, my girlfriend. Don't trust Crystal. She's working with your parents. Call me ASAP. And that's when I heard police sirens in the distance, getting closer to my apartment building. Crystal's smile never wavered. You might want to hold off on making that call. There's something about Sarah you need to know first. The police sirens weren't coming for me. They were after Tommy, who just crashed his car into the fountain outside my apartment building. He stumbled out of his wrecked BMW, bleeding from a cut on his forehead, and started screaming about Sarah being an FBI agent. Turns out, my girlfriend of 2 years wasn't just a kindergarten teacher from Minnesota like she'd claimed. She was Special Agent Sarah Collins, who'd been investigating a series of complex inheritance fraud cases across 5 states. Crystal, whose real name was actually Monica Wells, was supposed to be her key informant. Your parents aren't who you think they are either, Crystal/Monica said, watching Tommy's meltdown from my window. They're not victims in this story. They're the masterminds. She explained that my parents, Linda and Robert Mitchell, had been running an elaborate inheritance fraud scheme for nearly 3 decades. They would identify wealthy elderly people, befriend them, and then manipulate their wills through a network of corrupt lawyers and forged documents. Grandma Eleanor hadn't been their first target. She was just the latest in a long line of victims. Your dad's real name isn't even Robert Mitchell, Crystal continued. It's Anthony Kessler. He's wanted in Florida for a similar scam he ran in the 90s. Your mom was his partner in crime there too. I sat down hard on my couch, watching as Sarah, or Agent Collins, expertly tackled Tommy before he could run away from the approaching police cars. My whole life felt like a house of cards collapsing in slow motion. But the biggest shock came when Crystal pulled up a news article on her phone. It was from a small-town newspaper in Oregon, dated 1991. The headline read, Local couple dies in house fire, infant son missing. Below was a photo of a baby, me. You were never their son, Crystal said softly. You were their first victim. They took you from your real parents just before they died in that accidental fire. Eleanor knew something was wrong, but she could never prove it. That's why she hired me 5 years ago to investigate them. My grandmother had hired Crystal? The same grandmother who had supposedly left all that inheritance money? Nothing made sense anymore. The real will isn't about money, Crystal explained. Eleanor left you something much more valuable, evidence. Enough to put your so-called parents away for life. But she knew they'd destroy it if they found it, so she created this elaborate scheme. The inheritance, the wedding, all of it was a distraction. Just then, Sarah burst through my apartment door, gun drawn. FBI! Monica, hands where I can see them! Crystal just laughed. You're too late, Sarah. He already knows everything. And I've already sent the files to every major news outlet in the country. But Sarah wasn't looking at Crystal anymore. She was looking at me with real fear in her eyes. Jake, step away from her slowly. There's something about your grandmother's death that you need to know. And that's when my phone started ringing. The caller ID showed a number I'd never seen before, but the area code was from a small town in Oregon, the same town where my real parents had died 32 years ago. I answered the phone on speaker, my hand shaking. A familiar voice came through, one I'd heard every day of my life until last year. Jake, honey, it's Grandma Eleanor. The room went completely silent. Sarah lowered her gun, and Crystal's smug expression vanished. But you're dead, I managed to say. I was at your funeral. No, sweetheart. You were at a funeral, but it wasn't mine. My grandmother's voice was exactly as I remembered it. I had to disappear to protect you. The body in that casket was Maria Rodriguez, one of your parents' previous victims who'd been trying to expose them. They killed her and used her body to fake my death. Crystal, or Monica, suddenly looked nervous. This isn't possible. I saw the death certificate. Of course you did, Monica, Eleanor said. Because you're working with them too, aren't you? You always were. The whole investigation story was just another layer of manipulation. Sarah holstered her gun and pulled out her phone, quickly typing something. "She's calling from the Golden Pines retirement community in Bend, Oregon," she announced. "And she's right about Monica. We've suspected for months that she was a double agent, working for the Mitchells while pretending to help our investigation." Crystal made a dash for the door, but Sarah was faster. In seconds, she had Crystal handcuffed to my radiator. "Jake," Eleanor continued, "I needed you to understand who they really were, but I had to protect you too. They've killed everyone else who's tried to expose them. Your real parents, Maria, even your Uncle Richard, he didn't run away to South America. He figured out what they'd done to you, and they murdered him." My head was spinning. "But why the elaborate scheme with the inheritance?" "Because of what's hidden in that house you just bought," Eleanor explained. "In the basement, behind the old water heater, there's a safe. Inside is 30 years of evidence, photos, documents, recordings, everything they didn't want found. I couldn't tell you directly because they're always watching. I had to make you want to buy that house yourself." Suddenly, Crystal started laughing. "You're too late," she said. "They already found the safe last week. Why do you think they agreed to the rent increase so easily? They've been emptying it every night while Jake's been at work. By now, everything's probably ash." But Eleanor's voice remained calm. "The safe they found was a decoy. The real evidence is inside the water heater itself. I had it modified years ago. It's still functional, but half of it is a waterproof compartment. Your father, Robert or Anthony, or whatever he's calling himself now, did all the house maintenance himself because he never trusted anyone else. But he missed it." Sarah was already on her radio, calling for a forensics team. But then I heard something that made my blood run cold, the sound of a key in my front door lock. Only one other person had a key to my apartment. The door swung open, and there stood my mother, Linda Mitchell, holding a gun. But she wasn't alone. Behind her was someone I thought I'd never see again, Uncle Richard. "Hello, son," he said with a cold smile. "I think it's time we had a family reunion. Richard's been working with us the whole time," Linda said, keeping her gun steady. "Did you really think he'd choose some random woman and her baby over his own family?" Uncle Richard moved into the apartment, looking exactly like the photos I remembered, just older and harder. "Tommy was never my son," he sneered. "That was just another story to throw everyone off track. Your parents needed someone inside Eleanor's circle, and I played my part perfectly." Sarah had her gun trained on Linda, creating a tense standoff. Crystal was still handcuffed to the radiator, watching everything with calculating eyes. And through the phone speaker, I could hear Grandma Eleanor's steady breathing. "We've already called for backup," Sarah said calmly. "This building is about to be surrounded by FBI agents." Linda just laughed. "You think we didn't plan for that? Right now, your FBI team is responding to a false bomb threat at the Golden Pines retirement community in Oregon. By the time they realize Eleanor's not there, we'll be long gone." But something wasn't adding up. I looked at Uncle Richard, really looked at him for the first time. "If you've been working with them all along, why didn't you just kill Grandma Eleanor instead of letting her disappear?" A flicker of something, regret, fear, crossed Richard's face. Linda noticed it too, because she suddenly turned the gun on him. "Yes, Richard," she said coldly. "Why don't you tell Jake about your attack of conscience?" "Because Eleanor is my mother," Richard said quietly. "And she's your real grandmother, Jake." The room seemed to tilt on its axis. Linda's face contorted with rage. "You were supposed to take care of her, Richard. One simple job, make sure she never talked. Instead, you helped her disappear." "She's my mother," Richard shouted. "I could steal for you, lie for you, even pretend to be dead, but I couldn't kill her. She raised me alone after you, and Robert stole her identity and ruined her life. Did you really think I wouldn't recognize my own sister? My mother was actually my great-aunt. She and my father had stolen and assumed the identities of Richard's family decades ago, starting their crime spree with their own relatives. They'd been living under stolen identities for so long, they'd built their entire criminal empire on it." Suddenly, Tommy burst through the door, his face still bleeding from the car crash. "The police are coming," he yelled. "We need to." He never finished that sentence. Linda spun around and fired her gun, but Sarah was faster. Two shots rang out simultaneously. Linda dropped to the floor, clutching her shoulder. Tommy stood frozen, a red stain spreading across his expensive shirt. No! Richard lunged forward to catch Tommy as he fell. He's my sister's kid, my real sister, the one you murdered. I've been protecting him his whole life. Through the chaos, I heard Grandma Eleanor's voice from the phone. Jake, remember what I taught you about the family motto? Blood runs deeper than water? And suddenly I understood. The water heater. The real evidence. The family motto that Eleanor had made me memorize as a child. It wasn't just a saying. It was a clue about where she'd hidden something else. Something in the water supply of my parents' house. Something that would prove everything. But before I could process this revelation, the window behind me shattered. A familiar figure rappelled into the room. My father! Robert Mitchell, looking nothing like the man who'd raised me. And in his hand was a remote detonator. If I'm going down, he said, his finger on the button, I'm taking our whole fake family with me. Drop it, Robert, came a new voice from the doorway. Or should I say James Whitaker? Standing there was my real father, very much alive, wearing a police detective's badge. Next to him was my real mother. They were older versions of the couple I'd seen in that Oregon newspaper photo, but their eyes, my eyes, were unmistakable. Linda started laughing hysterically from her position on the floor. Impossible. We watched your house burn. You watched a house burn, my real mother corrected. But we'd already been working with the FBI for months. Eleanor had tipped us off about your plans. The truth poured out like a flood. My biological parents, David and Susan Carter, hadn't been random victims. They'd been undercover agents working to expose an international identity theft and fraud ring. Eleanor, discovering her own sister's involvement, had reached out to the FBI 30 years ago. But the investigation had to go deep underground after Linda and Robert murdered 3 federal agents. We had to let you take Jake, my real mother said, tears in her eyes. It was the only way to keep the investigation alive. Eleanor promised to watch over him, to protect him until we could dismantle the entire organization. Robert's finger tightened on the detonator. Very touching. But I still have enough explosives in the water main under your precious house to take out half the block. All that evidence Eleanor hid in the water supply? It'll be vaporized. The evidence isn't in the water supply, I said, finally understanding. It's in the family photo albums. The ones full of water damage that you never threw away because Mom, Linda, insisted on keeping them. Grandma Eleanor didn't hide documents in the water heater. She hid them in plain sight, treated with some kind of invisible ink that only appears after water exposure. That's why you always got nervous when anyone looked at those albums too closely. Sarah nodded. We've already recovered them. The water damage was actually a sophisticated chemical process that preserved 30 years of account numbers, dates, and photos. Everything's been documented and uploaded to secure FBI servers. Robert's face contorted. He pressed the detonator button repeatedly, but nothing happened. Looking for this? Tommy pulled out a small circuit board from his pocket, his gunshot wound now clearly revealed as a blood pack. I switched it while you were watching your dramatic entrance in the window reflection. Always so theatrical, weren't you, Uncle James? Within minutes, the apartment was swarming with FBI agents. Linda and Robert, or whatever their real names were led away in handcuffs. Crystal/Monica was taken into federal custody. Richard surrendered peacefully, already working on a plea deal in exchange for his testimony. Tommy wasn't really shot. He'd been an undercover agent himself, placed specifically to infiltrate the organization through their weakness for manipulating family ties. The car crash had been staged to create a diversion. I stood in my apartment, now crowded with federal agents, looking at my real parents. 30 years of separation stretched between us like a canyon. Eleanor appeared on Sarah's video call, crying and apologizing for all the secrets. The house is still yours, she said. I never lied about wanting you to have it. Your parents' old retirement fund, their real one, not the stolen money, has been in a trust all this time. It's more than enough to cover the purchase price. Sarah came over and took my hand. I really am a kindergarten teacher, she said with a small smile. Just one who happens to work for the FBI's Witness Protection Program. And I really do love you. I looked around at my complicated, broken, healing family. The inheritance I'd lost and found. The truth that had finally come to light. The love that had survived 3 decades of lies. So, I said to my real parents, I guess we have a lot of catching up to do. My father smiled. We do. Starting with your real name, it's Carter. Nathan Carter. And somehow, that felt right. Jake Mitchell had been born from lies, but Nathan Carter had finally found his way home. As for the house, I kept it. But instead of renting it out, I turned it into a halfway house for victims of identity theft and fraud. Linda and Robert's old family home became a place of healing for people putting their lives back together after having them stolen, just like mine had been. Sometimes, the best revenge isn't about getting even. It's about making something good out of all the bad. And that's an inheritance worth more than any amount of money.